The tensions between the colonies of South Africa and the feared Zulu Kingdom are reaching a boiling point, and 3 border incidents will light the powder keg which will explode into an all-out war. The political and territorial ambitions of the British Empire now sought to unify these South African colonies into one single confederation. Now these 3 incidents will catch the eyes of one cunning and ruthless politician, Sir Henry Bartle Frere. The British-run South African coalition will now use this new border crisis, referred to by locals as incidents of little consequence, to springboard an invasion from Natal and Transvaal into the heart of Zululand. One empire fights for unification and control over the region, the supremacy of the Christian white minority over the black majority. The other for the survival of their kingdom and culture in the face of a technologically superior adversary. Using eyewitness testimonies, we reconstruct the events moment by moment, leading to the war sparked by the ambitions of the very few. A war which would lead to the death of thousands, and would shape the future of South Africa forever.
British troops continued to arrive in Natal from Cape Colony, their progress slowed by the challenging terrain. Among them was the 24th Regiment of Foot, destined to play a pivotal role in the impending conflict. Lord Chelmsford had ordered these men toward the border, and expected them to arrive quickly. Instead, he was met by great delays, Natal's terrain too unfavorable. One Natal witness wrote the following, quote,
"A worse country for marching troops in can scarcely be conceived, and none save those who have followed troops in their march can form an idea of the difficulties they have to contend with, nor the stubborn firmness with which they face them."
Another soldier grumbled in a letter to his family, quote,
"I've been marching all over Africa and have not known what it is to sleep in a bed for this time. My clothes are worn to rags and I have not a boot on my feet, and God knows when I shall get any."
Chelmsford had gathered extensive information about the best locations to ford the Buffalo and Blood Rivers. He currently rode with a small entourage towards Fort Pearson, perched on a knoll overlooking the Blood River. Having heard of the shallow waters, and now seeing them firsthand, he decided this would be an ideal location to launch his invasion. Chelmsford issued a direct order to Henry Bulwer, quote,
"Recruit young men who were strong, and who could ride and shoot well."
Many of these levies would fall under Anthony Durnford's command. All of colonial South Africa braced for the coming war, raising militias, redeploying soldiers from other provinces, and gradually uniting under Lord Chelmsford's command. They ranged from British regulars to volunteers to artillery, local and native cavalry and militias, a hodgepodge of different men and background. But the army was taking shape. King Cetshwayo awaited news of what the British would do to Zululand. A messenger approached him, the Zulu king remaining seated. Following custom, the messenger bowed and extended the letter to his king, to which Cetshwayo eagerly took it. For could this be a declaration of war? Had the Boers and British colonials agreed to renegotiate the 1873 borders, the ones confirmed less than a year prior? What did these white men plan for his kingdom? He opened the letter, read it, feeling a mixture of optimism and justified caution. It explained that come December 11th, 1878, a meeting will be held at Lower Drift. This meeting aimed to resolve the border question and hopefully avert a war. It was signed by Lieutenant Governor Bulwer himself, something that eased Cetshwayo's tensions. He knew that Bulwer, at least in part, agreed with the Zulus that war was unnecessary. Cetshwayo summoned 3 Indunas to attend this affair. They'd be responsible for picking the other subordinates to attend with them, and they chose 11 other chieftains. In the meantime, Quechua would continue to prepare for the worst, keeping his 40 to 50,000 man army at the ready to defend their homeland. Captain Shepstone, son of Theophilus Shepstone, of the Natal Mounted Volunteers and Carbineers, ordered his men assembled. The bugles sounded, and soldiers lined up ready for inspection, others mounting their horses and formed up. This drew a considerable crowd, one which admired the well-dressed troop. They mustered, having heard of Lord Chelmsford's imminent arrival. Chelmsford rode through the columns, greeting Shepstone, and the two saluted before Chelmsford expressed his regrets. Despite being the military commander of South Africa, he'd never seen these men before. He then raised his voice, letting it carry to soldier, militia, and civilian alike. He had every confidence that these men would fight valiantly for their just cause in Zululand if war should commence. Chelmsford inspected the men, giving the impression of genuine interest. In truth, his main purpose was waiting for Henry Bartle Frere. The High Commissioner arrived a half-hour after the inspection, and together they rode along the lines of men, looking prim and proper. Captain Shepstone then directed the troops for drill and some maneuvers, dazzling the civilians and impressing Frere. But both he and Chelmsford had seen enough. They rode off to further their schemes. Around this time, Frere and Chelmsford discussed the strategy for invading Zululand. Both men were aware of Parliament's disapproval of the unfolding situation in South Africa and its orders to avoid war entirely. Frere had written to the Secretary of War on October 14th, yet that letter hadn't arrived until November 16th. They'd yet to receive a response, but Frere realized he could exploit the time lag between dispatches. While London might oppose a war, Frere now considered starting one before they could intervene. This, in turn, would force Britain into supporting Frere's actions in the adoption of a South African confederation. Chelmsford's request for reinforcements hadn't been granted to an extent he desired. He wanted to bolster his army to approximately 24,000 men, knowing the Zulus had an army over double that number. But with British guns and artillery, Chelmsford would easily crush his Zulu opponents, or so he thought. Calculating his numbers, Chelmsford discovered he had the following: cavalry, including the Imperial Mounted Infantry, Natal Mounted Police, and the local forces raised throughout the colonies, including the Natal Native Horsemen, numbered at 1,040. Artillery, 260 men. Imperial Infantry, 5,120. Native levies, with their white officers and assigned NCOs, 8,700 men. This gave Chelmsford an approximate total of 15,120 men for his invasion. This fell well short of what he envisioned. He nevertheless wanted to go ahead with his plan, Frere now having conveyed to him that a date already existed for a war to start. That day would be January 11th, 1879. In a letter to Chelmsford, Frere warned him,
"As long as all goes smoothly and successfully, the opposition here will only murmur. But a slight check or small inroad of Zulus would bring them out open-mouthed."
In July of 1878, Chelmsford had foreshadowed how he'd handle the Zulus in the event of war. In a letter to Sir Theophilus Shepstone, the arbiter of the negotiated border between Transvaal, Natal, and Zululand, he wrote, quote,
"The Zulus have been very kind to us in abstaining from any hostile movements during the time we were so bitterly engaged in the 9th Frontier War in this colony. If they will only wait until next month, I hope to have the troops somewhat better prepared than they are at present. If we are to have a fight with the Zulus, I am anxious that our arrangements should be as complete as it is possible to make them. Half measures do not answer with the native. They must be thoroughly crushed to make them believe in our superiority."
The fact that the Zulus had shown no aggression toward Natal or Transvaal since the border incident was irrelevant to either man, nor the many bureaucrats serving under both. Quechua's repeated offers for peace including compensation for the damages from Chief Seheo's dispute over his unfaithful wives, had also fallen upon deaf ears. Meanwhile, Frere knew the Colonial Office in London favored mediation. This hadn't changed since receiving that dispatch from the Colonial Office in mid-October. Chelmsford convinced the Natal government to divide the colony into 3 districts. The reorganization thought to fortify defenses against the civilian population's greatest fears: Zulu raids along the border, or worse, a large-scale invasion across the Buffalo and Blood rivers. With these new regiments being formed, notably the native contingents, Anthony Durnford was hard at work shaping both infantry and horsemen alike. He assembled his men in Greytown, where he established his headquarters in a small farm. It is here he received orders from Lord Chelmsford. With his compliments, Durnford learned he'd take part of the No. 2 column toward Rorke's Drift, and he'd take command of the Middle Drift to secure a crossing in Zululand. Henry Bartle Frere and Lieutenant Governor Bulwer had a few other meetings discussing the border between Natal and Zululand. Throughout the remainder of November, the two debated and fought one another over the course of action to answer the Zulu question. Bulwer remained adamant that Cetshwayo had shown no signs of major aggression along the border. The Boundary Commission, headed by Bulwer, had concluded in July in favor of the Zulu. The border would remain as it is. That didn't play into Frere's plans. It would be tacked on as a conclusion and presented to the Zulus on the agreed date of December 11th.
Chelmsford and Frere knew this ultimatum wouldn't be acceptable to King Cetshwayo, and this would be all the excuse they needed to justify their war with Zululand.
The 3 Indunas and their 11 chosen chieftains approached the Blood River to attend the border decision ceremony as planned. They were well aware of the opposing force awaiting them. The British had turned Lower Drift into a small fort, armed with 2 breech-loading cannons and even Gatling guns. The British soldiers watched them with great caution behind their walls of sandbags, their guns stacked together, bayonets thankfully unfixed. Nevertheless, being surrounded by so many well-armed soldiers created a lasting sense of unease. Then they were escorted to a small shelter constructed from white canvas sailcloth rigged in the branches of a fig tree. Said tree stood proudly close to the riverbank. Above the Zulu envoys, the sun shone upon them with a blistering heat. Even the Zulu, accustomed to such weather more than their British counterparts, were coated in sweat from their journey. An ironic twist was that there had been a torrential downpour not a day prior, leaving several places muddy and near impassable. The canvas sailcloths casted a broad shadow that stretched across the Blood River, making it an ideal meeting spot. It had just turned 11 o'clock a.m. The British representatives awaited for the Zulu in Daba, watching the Zulus closely and with skeptical eyes. Some were civilian representatives from Natal, while others belonged to the regular army or militia. Much to the Zulus' surprise, they were greeted warmly, though a sense of tension lingered in the humid air. A call was given, and together the British, Boers, and Zulu drank beer and ate beef. This camaraderie lasted for hours, creating a surprisingly festive atmosphere for both parties, helping ease the tension with the Zulu representatives. The beer, a significant part of Zulu rituals symbolizing hospitality and community, had nevertheless intoxicated the Indaba, a fact British representatives duly noted. With the meeting ready to begin, the Zulus sat on the ground, following their customary practice for such events. The British, however, disregarded this custom and sat on chairs arranged by their subordinates. The commission read its findings, which pleased the Zulu delegation as they favored Zululand on many points. Meanwhile, in a building far, far away, Frere paced in a building, awaiting news that his little trap had been sprung. The commission finished their report, and the Zulus rose and accepted. They deliver this to their king and vow to honor the ruling. The British representatives then halted the Zulus, announcing that there was more to discuss. This greatly alarmed the Indaba, and they all sat once more, many frustrated, resenting British customs which dragged proceedings to a crawl. But others were overcome with terror. They'd known, as Quechua informed them, that the Border Commission would read their findings. But nothing of this. Rising from his chair, one of Frere's representatives read aloud a 13-part ultimatum that would set the trap and plunge the Zulu people into conflict, fulfilling the ambitions of Sir Bartle Frere and Lord Chelmsford.
1. Surrender of Sahayo's 3 sons and brothers to be tried by the Natal courts. 2. Payment of fine of 500 head of cattle for the outrages committed by the above and for Quechua's delay in complying with the requests of the Natal government for the surrender of the offenders. 3. Payment of 100 head of cattle for the offenses committed against Messrs. Smith and Dayton. 4. Surrender of the Swazi chief Umblini and others to be named hereafter to be tried by the Transvaal courts. 5. Observance of the coronation promises. 6. That the Zulu army be disbanded and the men allowed to go home. 7. The Zulu military system be discontinued and other military regulations adopted, to be decided upon after consultation with the Great Council and British representatives. 8. That every man, when he comes to a man's estate, shall be free to marry. 9. All missionaries and their converts who until 1877 lived in Zululand shall be allowed to return and reoccupy their stations. 10. All such missionaries shall be allowed to teach, and any Zulu, if he chooses, shall be free to listen to their teaching. 11. A British agent shall be allowed to reside in Zululand, who will see that the above provisions are carried out. 12. All disputes in which a missionary or European is concerned shall be heard by the king in public and in the presence of the residents. 13. No sentence of expulsion from Zululand shall be carried out until it has been approved by the resident.
At this, stunned and inwardly crushed, the Zulu Indaba rose and left the British delegation to themselves. Frere's operative then dictated a letter to be delivered to Bartle Frere that his ultimatum had been formally delivered to the Zulu. As the Zulu delegation crossed back across the Blood River, an anger began to fester inside themselves.
Even before delivering such a farce to their king, they understood the connotations behind Frere's ultimatum. They weren't dumb. In no way, shape, and form would a society built around the military and its military traditions survive accepting Frere's demands. And King Quechua, who had spent most of his reign reconstructing Shaka Zulu's military traditions, wouldn't throw all of that away to appease the quote-unquote white invaders from Europe.
On December 13th, 1878, Frere received a solitary telegram from the colonial office. It told him, in no uncertain terms, that there was to be no war with the Zulus. Frere, believing the die had already been cast with his ultimatum delivered, dismissed the message. He looked to Chelmsford for reassurance, and the general assured Frere of a quick victory. With his word of honor, Frere knew they'd soon defeat, quote, the Black Devils, as Frere now referred to them, and resolve the Zulu question once and for all.
News arrived to King Quechua that same day,
and he immediately put things into motion. Quechua did not want war with Great Britain, fully aware of the devastating cost to his people. With their vast resources and superior technology, the Zulus didn't stand a chance. So he stalled for time. The ultimatum took Quechua by surprise, as it had most of those attending the original meeting. He understood that the British feared the Zulu army and suspected that seizing more of Zululand might, at worst, placate them. But this, the total destruction of Zululand's essence and its military, left the king momentarily speechless. Appropriately, it had begun raining, as December and January are the height of the rainy season in South Africa. Still in slight denial of his British allies and their betrayal, Cetshwayo would comply with several of the 13 demands made by Frere. He swiftly gathered resources and dispatched letters detailing his predicament. One of the first things Cetshwayo did was agree to give up Chief Seheo's sons for their transgressions into Natal. Then he'd pay the fine with cattle, as expressed in the ultimatum. In this, he pleaded with Frere to understand that 30 days would be insufficient to gather the required cattle, especially with recent torrential downpours slowing transport across Zululand. Frere rejected his pleas outright. King Cetshwayo learned that the cattle still hadn't arrived across the border and into Natal. In response, several individuals seeking to prevent war in Natal initiated negotiations with both British representatives and emissaries of the Zulu King. The primary element of these negotiations was time. The amount of cattle demanded to be turned over would greatly harm the populace of Zululand, possibly leading to starvation. But Cetshwayo hadn't a choice. The choice was between a few starving or a total destruction of his kingdom. He also deliberately delayed collecting Chief Seheo's sons. Quote,
"Why does the government name days and count them out to him? He cannot get all the cattle together within the days mentioned, as the land is great and he has to seek them,"
wrote one negotiator to a letter to Frere. Meanwhile, just a day prior, Bartel Frere had written in justification of his war with Cetshwayo, expressing an utmost confidence in victory. Quote,
"Cetshwayo is now wholly surrounded by Natal and the Transvaal. The Swazi and the Boers must sooner or later succumb. The only prospect was to stand and fight."
But this, to Cetshwayo, revealed Frere's mission all along. Frere had never meant for the Zulu king to meet this ultimatum. Realizing this, he began assembling his army and readying them for an all-out war with the British Empire. Especially now, as the 30 days dwindled, Cetshwayo had to keep his commanders in check. They were justifiably infuriated at Britain's demands, and they wanted blood. Their bloodlust had already been simmering, so Cetshwayo convened these commanders together and expressed a clear order that all were to obey. If the British soldiers entered Zululand across the Buffalo and Blood Rivers, the army was not to attack. The Zulu army was only to act if the British initiated hostilities, at which point they could unleash their full might. Amidst the ongoing rain, his commanders grumbled and moaned, but they would obey. And to err on the side of caution, Cetshwayo had another letter written, prepared, and sent to the Natal government. It informed the British colonists that the Zulu would neither attack soldiers crossing the river nor invade beyond their border. The Zulu army would stay in Zululand. To Cetshwayo, everything felt like a blur. It had all happened so quickly. Only mere months prior, he considered the British his friend. They had even crowned him King of the Zulus. Now they demanded he surrender everything he had built, threatening the destruction of his people's culture. News of Cetshwayo's standing order swiftly reached Lord Chelmsford's desk. It greatly irritated him. He knew the clock was ticking not just for the Zulus, but for an Anglo-Zulu war altogether. Frere's stalling of the British government could not continue indefinitely, and as of now, it was no secret to Chelmsford that the Prime Minister and the Colonial Office in London opposed any sort of war with the Zulu. Once the invasion began, he needed a swift victory. Some officers, like Colonel Durnford, warned of Zulu tenacity, that if the Zulu were to strike, they'd strike hard and quick. Chelmsford dismissed these concerns. In his view, the issue was not whether the Zulus would attack. In fact, he wanted the Zulus to be the aggressors. Instead, he feared that Cetshwayo's orders would lead the Zulu to avoid fighting entirely. And with no fighting, that would mean no victory. Without a victory, how could Frere justify their blatant defiance of London's orders? The humid, wet day saw Lord Chelmsford arriving at Thring's Post, a camp established on the Thukela frontier near the Zulu border. Accompanying him was a Natal reporter, eager to learn more about the escalating tensions between the British and the Zulu. Chelmsford hated reporters and felt he needed to walk a tightrope here. On one hand, reporters might expose too much about his and Bartle Frere's actions, particularly their direct disobedience of colonial office orders. If things went poorly, reporters would be the first to call for Chelmsford's removal. On the other hand, reporters seeing the discipline and order of his army would make for good press. Should a quick victory be achieved, the press would not just hail Chelmsford as a hero, but also ensure confidence in both Natal and Transvaal of Bartle Frere's South African Confederation. Through the rain, Chelmsford wished to climb the two hills overlooking Thring's Post. His entourage followed him, and upon one of the summits, he could see the Royal Artillery below on perfect display. Most of the guns were either 7mm or 9mm breech loaders, some of the best light artillery the British Army had to offer. To impress the reporters, he ordered a parade, undeterred by the rain. At around 4:00 p.m., the parade had concluded, and Chelmsford wished to give a few words. He explained to these troops, most of whom were young, inexperienced men, that war might be upon them in just a few days. They would cross the Buffalo River into Zululand. He reminded them to remain cool, keep their discipline, and maintain order at all times. He'd heard rumors that both native volunteers and inexperienced British soldiers feared the 40,000 to 50,000 man Zulu army. Their notoriety from the locals had spread amongst the camps like wildfire, and many of the local volunteers had personal experience with just how fierce the Zulu could be. Chelmsford made light of this, pointing to one of the NCOs standing before him. While the Zulu may be fierce, they are but savages armed with nothing but cowhide shields and spears. They will be no match for the Martini Henry, as one reporter described, quote,
Discipline was everything, and as Chelmsford had said before, he had the greatest reliance in the officers and would impress on the soldiers to obey them implicitly. He had no doubt but all would do their duty, as all would participate in the glory and honor which he firmly felt was in store for the men under his command.
That discipline soon came into question. As more troops arrived in Durban, it became apparent that many of the young Imperial soldiers liked to take part in drunken debauchery. This plagued Chelmsford come the early days of January 1879, as it did much to tarnish the hopes of a British Confederation. He would crack down on this with harsh punishment. Anthony Durnford rose as dispatchers from Lord Chelmsford arrived at his headquarters. They contained his next orders. Hoping he'd get the next chance to prove himself, he eagerly opened them. But upon reading, that sense of optimism faded. Lord Chelmsford instructed Durnford, particularly his cavalry, to remain on the defensive. Stationed at Middle Drift as previously ordered, Durnford was tasked with supporting the No. 1 column during the invasion, which was set to cross at Lower Drift. Simultaneously, he'd also need to help the No. 3 column crossing at Rorke's Drift. This achieved three things. It guarded Chelmsford's rear, assuring escape and supply routes remained open, and also spotting any counter-invasions. But he wouldn't be part of the invasion itself. So once again, Durnford felt himself robbed of his chance for glory. Frere stayed awake throughout the night, aware that to his northwest, Lord Chelmsford was on the verge of launching his invasion. He reflected on the letter delivered to him from the Colonial Office. Feeling clever, smug even, he lit a candle and began dictating his notes onto paper. He knew this letter would take a week, if not a full month, to reach London. The letter outlined his intentions, announced the invasion of Zululand, and detailed his supposedly just reason for initiating this war. By the time it reached the Colonial Office in London, Lord Chelmsford would have crushed the Zulu army and annexed the Zulu Kingdom. In this letter, Frere did not hold back his description of King Cetshwayo. Quote,
"We had exhausted all peaceful means in dealing with the Zulu. Of the perfect justice of our cause, I think you can have no doubt. By God's help, we can relieve South Africa of the Zulu incubus. The Zulu warriors' courage is the courage of maniacs and drunkards, of wild beasts infuriated and trained to destruction, and once cowed, they will not rally."
Once the letter was dispatched, Frere realized he hadn't stepped one foot into Zululand during his stint as High Commissioner, nor had he once met King Cetshwayo. He admired the timing of his actions, the ultimatum, and the collapse of diplomacy because he, like so many others in Cape Colony, knew that Chelmsford's invasion would be met with great success. For weeks now, sentries patrolling the Buffalo River watched across the border with mounting tension. They anticipated seeing a horde of Zulus any moment, yet it never came. The rolling hills beyond the Zulu border stayed empty, their lush greenery accentuated by recent rainfall. Some climbed hills tall enough to glimpse the Zulu kraals hidden beyond, noting their eerie stillness and emptiness. What the British didn't know was that they'd been abandoned many days ago, at the turn of the new year. Behind the sentries, endless rows of red-coated soldiers marched in column through deep mud, followed by wagon supplies stretching for miles. One regiment, the 24th, discovered itself by Rorke's Drift, a 12-mile journey from where Lord Chelmsford had established his headquarters in Helpmaker. Upon arriving, most of the soldiers began writing to their wives and families. Some were goodbyes, means to ends should they die, but most wrote of the grand adventure awaiting them in Zululand. In the days prior to January 11, 1879, Royal Engineers got to work building bridges across the Buffalo River, one of these men being John Rouse Marriott Chard. Their task at Rorke's Drift was to build these bridges, and to make ferrying across the soldiers into Zululand an easy affair. Surgeon General James Henry Reynolds was also tasked in erecting a hospital here, the march to the Buffalo River leaving many sick with tropical diseases. This site would serve as a launching point for the main invasion force. Among the riders was the newly promoted Brevet Colonel Durnford. He galloped along the Buffalo River with his native horsemen, his left arm still immobilized and held within his uniform, useless. But he'd long grown accustomed to this limitation. A lot had happened since 1873, and he'd been finally given another proper command. This time, it wouldn't just be for a small rebellion, but a full-scale war. Like the centuries before him, Durnford and his cavalry found no opposing Zulu whatsoever, so he reported to Lord Chelmsford just that. One would think this would have a calming effect over the officer corps. Instead, the lack of Zulu presence only made tensions higher, and especially the civilians of Natal. Where could the Zulu army be hiding? January 11th was now just a day away, and stretched out for miles were the newly erected camps, with sounds of bands playing their military marches and beating their drums. These men were excited for war. At the stroke of midnight, engineers and sappers hurried across the Buffalo River under the cover of darkness and prepared the barges that would ferry the British into Zululand. Some cavalry also crossed, many under Colonel Durnford's command, serving as scouts and guards. One thing all these men feared was an ambush by even a small column of Zulu warriors, but the presence of friendly cavalry soothed these tensions. Yet as dawn appeared over Zululand, these feared warriors were nowhere to be seen. Durnford half expected this, knowing these warriors had mastered the arts of silence and patience, for if the Zulu were not ready to attack, they would not attack. He galloped through several small kraals, finding each empty of any and all life. Those that lived here had left in a hurry, not wasting a thing, taking much of the cattle with them. Unbeknownst to him, scores of Zulu spies had infiltrated the British ranks. They watched the invasion with great interest, running, riding, and relaying any and all information about British movements to their king. Henry Bartle Frere's letter reached the Colonial Office in London on the morning of January 13th. Secretary of State of the Colonies, Michael Hicks Beach, had expected something from Frere for the past few weeks. He'd awaited anxiously to learn of the developing situation in South Africa, balancing his support for Frere's actions with the cautious stance of Britain's current Prime Minister. Spotting Frere's name, he quickly opened the letter on a dreary London morning. He scanned the contents and found them unsurprising. Then he read the date, January 4th, 1879. Instantly, Beach realized the ultimatum had expired, and as he stood reading Frere's letter, a war had likely already begun, and he had to see the Prime Minister, and fast. Through letters and direct meetings, both Beach and the Prime Minister discussed the unfolding situation. The Prime Minister remained firm in his decision not to fully support the war, while Beach, ever the pragmatist, introduced a concern beyond public war fatigue: budget. There was genuine fear in the cabinet of sinking money and time into this South African adventure, as many saw it, quote,
"Although Frere's policy, especially in the matter of cost, is extremely inconvenient to us at the moment, I am sanguine as to its success and think we shall be able to, without much difficulty, defend its principles."
Beach wanted the South African Confederation, especially if it meant British rule. But he also wanted options, the ability to shut Frere down, or to go ahead. Instead, Frere forced his hand. Like Frere, Beach regarded the Zulu as inferior, dismissing them as merely a horde of savages. He didn't want a war, but he had every confidence that Lord Chelmsford would succeed against the, quote, Black Horde. Beach seemingly played a role in persuading the Prime Minister to adopt a similar stance. Beach's confidence in the British victory was so strong that he reversed his earlier position, so long as no additional troops were needed in South Africa. For the moment, Henry Bartle Frere's position remained secure. The full moon of January, deeply significant to the Zulus, heralded one of their most important traditions. It marked the beginning of the first fruits ceremony, a celebration of the harvest and a prosperous year for the Zulu people. Warriors from across Zululand were required to gather at their barracks in Nodwengu, near King Cetshwayo's residence in Undini. The Zulus danced and sang, crying out with the spirits for a bountiful harvest and the prosperity of their homeland. Renowned for their musicality, the Zulus combined percussion and voices into an awe-inspiring display involving thousands. The women, bare-chested, enticed the approaching warriors, who danced in response to display their strength and readiness for marriage. As one eyewitness described it, quote,
bending their bodies forward to the clap of their hands, stamping both their feet together and raising their voices to the highest pitch, they fill in their parts and follow out the chorus with such a degree of continued exertion as would cause a European woman to go upon crutches for the remainder of her life.
There were many festivities despite the worries King Cetshwayo held. To those warriors, young and old, the threat of war only brought more jubilation, making this ceremony all the more livelier. Cetshwayo found some solace in his spies' reports on British and colonial troop movements across the border. He'd already discerned Lord Chelmsford's plan of invasion and begun hatching his own counter. During a meeting with his chieftains, Cetshwayo uncovered deep division among them. Some would hand over Chief Saheo and his sons willingly in exchange for continued Zulu sovereignty. This faction firmly believed that surrendering Saheo, his sons, and the cattle would appease the British. Cetshwayo was tempted, as he did not fully view the British as enemies. However, his loyalty to Chief Saheo and respect for his sons gave him pause. To deliver them to Natal for trial would be like taking some of his own body. That growing frustration had nevertheless shown itself in a letter Quechua had written to the Natal government. Quote,
"The English had thrown the bullock's skin over my head whilst they had been devouring the tippets of the carcass."
Quechua made his decision that day, commanding that a black bull be brought to Nodwengu. He then ordered his warriors to march with him to the sacred burial ground of past Zulu kings. They marched in tandem, led by their king, the black bull being tugged behind him. And when they arrived, the war doctors began calling upon their ancestral spirits. "Follow the army," they called. "Bless the army. Bless the Zulu warriors for the struggle to come. Give their blessing to the commencement of a war the Zulus had never waged before." The black bull had been brought forward and let loose. The best and brightest soldiers were then summoned to kill the beast in front of a cheering crowd of their fellow men. Once the bull had been killed, the 40,000 Zulus roared in a thunderous cry. For several days, King Quechua slept and ate with his warriors on the hallowed ground. On the final day, the witch doctors produced a brew that was said to cleanse the Zulu warriors' spirits. One by one, the Zulus drank the potion, which induced vomiting. Any seen faking such an important part of the ritual were beaten severely by the doctors. Finally, the witch doctors brought forth the roasted remains of the killed black bull. They called the troops forward, gathering them in a giant circle. Together, the warriors ate the beast's body and were given a strange elixir of different narcotics and herbs. As the ceremonies were completed, Quechua gathered his commanders one final time. His words were clear. Most notably, he called forward the most venerable warrior, Tishingueo, an old man. His hair and beard were gray, but the Zulu general did not lack for his physical fitness. He'd helped lead the armies to great victories, and Quechua told him, quote,
"March slowly, attack at dawn, and eat up the red soldiers."
The Zulu army chanted, cheered, rallying themselves for the coming battle. Quechua resolved to direct his army against the nearest threat to Ondini, where reports indicated British invaders were approaching the steep mountain of Isandawana. There, these red soldiers, as he put it, would meet the horns of the buffalo.